There were times in the history of our civilization when one person could own another person as a thing and use him for his own needs. This was considered the norm. In this video, I will tell you about this phenomenon, but first, please subscribe to my channel and like it. That will help YouTube algorithms recommend my videos to new viewers more often. Thank you. So, the video presents 10 interesting facts about slavery. Watch it to the end. It's the most interesting. So, slavery seems to us to be something that existed only in antiquity. Ancient Egypt or ancient Rome immediately comes to mind, but until about 200 years ago, slavery was legal and prosperous in the United States. Slaves there worked mostly on plantations in the southern states, where they worked the land and harvested crops. Black slaves were trafficked from Africa to the Americas through a well-developed system of human trafficking. European and American slave traders did not enslave Africans themselves. Instead, they bought black slaves from African rulers and traders, trading slaves mostly for firearms and rum. That is, the Africans themselves sold their African congeners to the Europeans. The regions of Africa where Europeans bought slaves are highlighted on this map. The slaves there were mostly prisoners of war from neighboring tribes. The Africans themselves not only sold slaves to the Europeans, but also used Arabian labor for themselves. Well, when Europeans began to buy slaves from African rulers, those rulers began to deliberately start wars against neighboring tribes in order to capture as many people as possible and sell them as slaves to Europeans and receive from them weapons and other goods that they themselves were not able to make. Firearms gave the armies of these African rulers a great advantage over their neighbors, who had only spears and bows. Slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas on special ships in terrible conditions. The more slaves the captain was able to take on board, the greater his profits. So the ships were filled to overflowing with live goods. This illustration shows how the slaves were arranged inside the ship. They could only lie there side by side next to each other, and the ship had several decks, that is, floors, and the whole ship was filled with slaves. Naturally, such conditions were completely unsanitary. Many slaves could not even get to a bucket to relieve themselves there, so they were forced to walk under themselves. The voyage from Africa to the Americas lasted about 4 or 5 weeks. During that time, on average, about 20% of the slaves died. The slave traders wrote off these deaths as a natural loss to business. There were even insurance companies in America that insured the lives of slaves and compensated the captains in the event of their deaths. At the same time, of course, the slave traders were interested in keeping the slaves alive and physically strong. Therefore, they were constantly taken outside and forced to do physical exercises and dance. In this way, the slave traders exhausted the slaves so that they had no desire or strength to revolt or escape. The black slaves had no idea where or why they were being taken. They had never seen white people before, so they thought that whites were cannibals, and that they bought black people to eat them, and then came back to Africa again to buy more. After arriving in America, they were sold in markets, after which they toiled in very harsh conditions, 12, 16 hours a day, on the plantations. Slaves were not allowed to leave the plantation. If any white man met a black man outside the plantation, he could demand to see his identification or a pass. If there was no pass, any white man could give the work 30 lashes. He had no right to resist, or else he would be executed. On large plantations, slaves lived in common barracks or huts. They could form families and have children. However, slave owners often sold their slaves and bought others, so it often happened that one family member, husband or wife, was simply taken and sold to someone else, and they were never seen again. It is reported that about 20% of black slave families were separated because the owner decided to sell someone. Imagine yourself in that situation. In December 1865, after the end of the American Civil War, slavery was abolished. Suddenly and abruptly, this shocked many slave owners, for the economy of some states depended entirely on plantation slave labor. Nevertheless, slave owners were forced to let their slaves go. However, not all slaves left their masters' plantations after gaining their freedom. Plantationers usually offered their former slaves work for money for very little, but still pay. Many planters treated their slaves normally, so the now free black people chose to stay on the plantation and work for pay. Many worked on the same plantations for the rest of their lives. Well, some left and looked for other work. There were also planters who could not keep their slaves even for money, and they went bankrupt soon after they lost their slaves because there was no one else to work on the plantations. But there were also special cunning slave planters who made the decision not to tell their slaves about the abolition of slavery. In some cases, this was possible if the plantation was very far from populated areas. Some even managed to keep it a secret from their slaves for more than a year. However, this was considered a serious crime, and many planters were caught and punished for it. There were even special people who traveled to different farms and gave the slaves the information that they were now free. Not all former slaves were able to enjoy their newfound freedom. Many of them did not know what to do with it, so they became drunk or criminals because they did not know what to do with their freedom. Many blacks continued to work on the plantations of their former masters, but for money. Throughout history, children have often been used as free laborers. Mostly, they were made to work alongside their parents in agriculture, helping to sow, harvest, etc. In most cases, they were kept close to their parents, and the parents could see to it that their children were not abused and that they were generally in order. There was, however, a period in human history when millions of children in the United States, Canada, and Europe were in actual slavery. We are talking about the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Industrial Revolution occurred in the Western world. Many factories and plants sprang up in the cities, and there was always a shortage of people to work in them. These were the days of wild capitalism, when workers in factories were paid a penny, worked 12 hours at a time, and were deprived of rights, unions, sick leave, and vacations. In those days, the use of child labor in factories and plants was widespread. They were paid, but several times less than adults, and children worked in very dangerous jobs, risking their lives and health every day. There were no norms or laws regulating child labor and labor in general in those days. Therefore, the lives of workers, especially those working in factories, and children were terrible. Many of these children were orphans and lived directly in the factories. There was no one to stand up for them, and the factory supervisors abused them in every way they could to get them to work. Or they were children from very large poor families whose parents were desperate for money and sent their children into the factory from the age of 5. The situation of these children in those days was slavery itself. In the 19th century, coal was the main fuel for the stoves. Because of this, the chimneys were quickly covered with soot and had to be cleaned. There were chimney sweeps for this purpose. Often an adult had to climb into it to clean the chimney, and small orphan children were picked up by chimney sweeps. They would train them and send them out to clean the chimneys instead of themselves, staying inside the chimneys for an hour or longer. The children were constantly breathing soot, which gave them a chronic runny nose and cough. They suffered from soot in their eyes, which led to vision problems. Many of them died of lung problems when they became young men. Quite often, children would get stuck in the chimney and start to panic, suffocating right inside the chimney. Other little chimney sweeps were sent to retrieve the body. In the 19th century, coal was the main fuel for steam engines, so the demand for it was enormous. The coal mines relied on the labor of small children, who were the ideal workers for the mine owners. After all, they could be paid much less than adult men. Children were small in stature, which allowed them to get into the narrowest of mines. The illustration shows 2 small children pushing a coal cart, one pulling from the front, the other pushing from the bottom. Since there was no electricity at the time, they moved the cart in the dark. The one in the front could see the light at the end of the mine, while the one pushing the cart from behind was in complete darkness and moved by touch. The picture shows young children sitting over the coal conveyors and clearing away the stones and debris with their bare hands. No gloves. A supervisor with a stick is watching them so they don't get lazy. Children worked in the mines for 12 or even 16 hours, often sleeping in them and breathing coal dust. Because of this, many of them died before the age of 25 from lung problems. The mines often had accidents and collapses that killed children and adults. For these children, many of whom were orphans, working in the mines was the only way to survive. But life on the surface was not easy either, with children working in the many factories and plants. They got up early in the morning and stood at the machines all day, trying to meet their quota. They were supervised by supervisors, and many children were injured by the machines. Factory owners simply threw unfit children out into the street. Certainly, the late 18th and throughout the 19th century were the most difficult times for children, who were often enslaved. In most cases, in different times and countries, slaves were used only for hard physical labor. They could not read or write. In ancient Rome, however, the situation was quite different. There were very many slaves there, and often they were captured enemies or debtors who could not pay their debts to their creditors. Of course, slaves in Rome did hard physical work, as they did everywhere else. However, the wealthy Romans used slaves not only as laborers, but also in various professions such as librarians, accountants, readers, painters, sculptors, personal secretaries, and even philosophers. Gentlemen spent money to train slaves in various skills so that they could then use their services or rent them out to other citizens of Rome who needed certain specialists. By the way, the word educator came into our language from ancient Greek and means leading a child. In ancient Greece and ancient Rome, old slaves who could no longer do physical work became educators. The slave master assigned them to teach a young child the basics of literacy and to accompany him everywhere, protecting him from dangers both physical and moral. Slaves in ancient Rome were able to attend theaters and stadiums in their free time. They dressed in ordinary Roman clothing and generally looked just like the Romans themselves, with the exception of slaves from Africa. For a time, the Roman government considered introducing a special uniform or insignia for slaves, so that anyone could see on the street that they were a slave man. However, this proposal was rejected because the government did not want the slaves to realize how many there really were in Rome because their numbers were so large. By avoiding visibility, the multitude of slaves could reduce the likelihood of their revolt and rebellion. Although many slaves had access to education and could go to the theater, overall life for most slaves in ancient Rome was very hard. They were fed food often intended for pigs. They were often beaten, deprived of food, and even executed for the slightest fault. Moreover, many of the executions were deliberately as painful and cruel as possible, since slaves were considered brutal and insensitive creatures. Accordingly, the Romans devised the most brutal executions for slaves, including cutting off ears and noses and grinding them in millstones if they were caught stealing bread or flour. Women were also forced into prostitution at feasts. The lords wiped their hands on the hair of their slaves, who were always around. In addition, there was a law that if a mistress married her slave, she would face the death penalty. The husband of the slave was burned alive. Under Roman law, slaves were equated with things and were not considered human beings. Later, the Romans began to try to alleviate the plight of slaves by legislating restrictions on what their masters could do with them. However, this concern for slaves was inhumanistic and was motivated by the need to prevent possible rebellion. Rome's rulers understood that mistreatment of slaves, cruelty, and abuse could cause resentment and increase the likelihood of slave revolt. Therefore, laws were gradually introduced to protect slaves from the lawlessness of their masters, although they were not always enforced. There were many slaves in Rome, so any rebellion could seriously affect the stability of the state. Even in ancient Rome, there was a festival called Saturnalia in honor of Saturn, the god of the Roman boarding house. During the Saturnalia, slaves were allowed to eat at the same table with their masters, free to criticize them, but they had to serve their slaves. In other words, they sort of switched places. They knew that if they offended their masters in any way, they would have a difficult time at the end of the Saturnalia. Therefore, they did not abuse their temporary position during the feast, but at least they had the opportunity to eat and rest well. There are many interesting things to tell about slavery among the ancient Aztecs. It was very different from slavery in other civilizations. In the Aztec Empire, slaves had several ways to stop being slaves and regain their freedom. The first of these ways was simply to redeem oneself from one's master. In ancient Rome, this was also sometimes possible, but not always. You may ask how a slave could have money. After all, slaves received a small salary from their masters so that they would be more motivated to work. Most of the fruits of the slave's labor went to his master, but the slave received the hope of freedom, so he worked more efficiently to earn more. If the slave managed to accumulate enough money, he could redeem himself and become a free man. Aztec society believed that a slave who could save up money for many years was a disciplined and purposeful person who would be useful in society as a free man. Another way to free oneself was to prove to the court that the master had mistreated and abused the slave. In such a case, the master could be fined or even sentenced to slavery as punishment. Therefore, slave owners in the Aztec Empire had to treat their slaves normally. If the owner killed his slave, it was considered murder, and slave owners could be tried and punished. Sometimes they were even forced to be sacrificed to the Aztec gods or turned into slaves. A slave could also gain his freedom by marrying his master. The strangest way for a slave to be free, however, was to run away. Sometimes slaves were taken to the city to be sold, at which point the slave had the opportunity to be legally free. While being transported to the marketplace, the slave had to be able to break free from the fetters and chains, run outside the marketplace, and step in human feces with his foot. The slave could then go to court and be given his freedom. Only the master or his relatives could chase a fleeing slave. If outsiders helped to catch the slave, they were severely punished by turning them into slaves. I can imagine how frustrated a slave was if he managed to run outside the marketplace but could not find human feces lying in the street anywhere to fully comply with the conditions for his release. But not all Aztec slaves decided to buy their freedom by saving enough money. Surprisingly, the law allowed slaves to have their own slaves. As paradoxical as it may sound, some slaves did have their own slaves who worked for them. The fact is that prices for different slaves could vary greatly, depending on the skill, health, and experience of the slave. There were times when a slave would buy his own slaves because his own ransom price was very high, and with that money he could buy several slaves for himself to gradually earn a slave for his owner. So they simply made their slaves work in their place. It is also interesting that the children of slaves were not slaves, and were born free men because it was believed that children were not responsible for the debts or crimes of their parents. In most other civilizations in the world, the children of slaves were also slaves and the property of their masters. But the Aztecs were different. In spite of this, the threat of slavery to children still existed. The fact is that Aztec parents had the right to sell their young children into slavery to pay off debts, but the procedure was not so simple. It was only allowed to sell children into slavery if the family was very poor. They had to go to the authorities for permission to do this. They had to describe how poor they lived. Selling a child into slavery gave him the opportunity to at least live with a master who would provide him with shelter, clothing, and food. In addition, he could in principle redeem his freedom in the future. The poor family, on the other hand, received money and lost the need to feed one person, which saved money. It is also worth mentioning that the Aztecs had the option of selling themselves into slavery. The ancient Romans, by the way, also had such a form. You may wonder, why sell yourself into slavery? Slavery is horrible. However, selling oneself into slavery was the only way out for various Aztecs who found themselves in dire financial straits. For example, if they accumulated an insurmountable amount of debt, or if they lost everything, they did not even have a place to live, so some sold themselves into slavery to help their relatives. After a person was sold into slavery, he was given time to spend the money he received for his freedom, either to cover his debts, to give to his relatives, or simply to skip and lose. People did this too after the money was spent. They became slaves once more. Gambling was very common among the Aztecs, so some gamblers who lost everything put their own freedom on the line, and if they lost, they became slaves to whoever won them. It may seem that the slaves of the Aztec Empire had very many civil rights. That is because, in fact, they did. However, the punishment for slaves was also very cruel. If a slave was disobedient, his master could drag him to the main square and announce it publicly to everyone. If this happened 3 times, the slave could be sold to another master. Also, disobedient slaves were made to wear special wooden blocks around their necks with sticks sticking out. They showed society that he was a disobedient slave and also prevented him from escaping through the narrow passages. Also, if a slave was sold more than 4 times because of disobedience, the 5th time he could be sold not to another master, but to a sacrifice. Let me remind you that the Aztecs were very fond of human sacrifices to the gods, so the disobedient slaves had to suffer the same fate. Their gods were very fond of blood. Captive Aztec enemies were often enslaved. Warriors purposely did everything possible to capture captives alive. Most of these captives were eventually sacrificed, but some of them became slaves. Some were even lucky enough to save enough money to buy their freedom. The Aztecs themselves also became slaves if a court found them guilty of grave crimes such as murder. They could make a slave of the person of the family they had killed. There are no more countries in the world where slavery has been allowed at the state level. But this does not mean that there is no slavery at all in today's world. The UN estimates that there are approximately 40 million slaves in the world today, most of them in Asia and Africa. Many of them are children who work in various mines, extracting precious minerals, and in factories and farms. They either have no parents or they do. But interestingly, in poor countries where there is in fact slavery, it is the parents themselves who sell their children to slave owners and never see them again. Young children are used in Africa to harvest cacao beans. They live in certain communities where the masters feed and clothe them, but they receive no payment for their labor, and it is also impossible for them to get out of there. Therefore, this can be considered a full-fledged modern form of slavery. And poor African governments often turn a blind eye to this, since the sale of cocoa is an important source of income for them. And in Pakistan, there is the following problem. Hundreds of children are kidnapped there every year to be sold to Arab countries to become camel jockeys. In many Arab countries, especially in the Arab Emirates, camel racing is very popular. Rich Arabs put their money on this or that camel and have so much fun. To make the camels run faster, they use small children as riders, because they are much lighter than adults. Moreover, children, in addition to being kept in slavery, are restricted in their food so that they do not gain weight and become too heavy. The Emirati government combats this phenomenon by, for example, limiting the minimum age of children who can be such riders. But nevertheless, the illegal trafficking of children to make them camel riders still exists and flourishes. Therefore, although slavery is no longer legal anywhere as it once was, it still exists today in our modern world, and the situation of such slaves is in some cases even worse than that of slaves in the olden days. Write in the comments what topic you would like me to make a video on in the future. I read your comments, and they really help promote the video. Next, I suggest you watch my videos about scary science experiments in ancient Rome. It will be interesting. The links will be right on the screen. I really ask you to like it and click on the bell for the YouTube algorithm, if you want to help me develop. Bye.